right. Hello to everyone joining us, whether it's in the recording or here in the Zoom room today. My name is Darren Calhoun, and my pronouns are he, him, and I serve on the board of Q Christian Fellowship, along with my co-convener and collaborator in building this group that is the equity. My co-convener and collaborator, Carrie, uh, uh, as we built this equity, diversity, inclusion group at Q Christian Fellowship. The idea here is that as an organization, as an institution, as a community, we want these values of equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging to be something that we work out in every level, everything from how our budget is as a nonprofit to how our community interacts and thinks about these various topics. And so this is the community portion of that. There's work that happens where on the board level, we work with the staff to think about our speakers and think about what kind of experiences we have and where we have them and who's able to access our spaces. And then as a community, we hold these monthly gatherings on the first of the month this year. We hold these gatherings to create space for us to learn together, for us to ask questions, for us to hear from perspectives we may not have otherwise have access to. And then for us to be reflecting on how that looks in our lives and in the relationships that we have. So tonight we have two very, very wonderful people who I hold near and dear to my heart, who are going to be sharing with us um, about our inclusive language when it comes to gender and worship. And I've had the pleasure of working with them in churches and in leadership and in marching through the streets of Chicago at the Pride Parade. And I love the work that they're doing. They're two individuals who are of trans experience and who just live into being authentic in ways that I think are so important and critical to the church. So Josie White is pronounced she, her, and we've worked together as worship leaders and met many, many years ago. And it was kind of hilarious because when I first met Josie, she was all like, "Oh my gosh, like I've seen you," and now like we're sharing same stages together. So it's like, yes, we are coming along and doing the things together. So I love that. It just speaks to the power of relationship and connection. You never know where a chance meeting in a room like this can go. And then there's Wing Yun, who is doing some really, really powerful work here in Chicago with this effort or this movement called God's Closet, where they are creating opportunities for people to share and to thrift clothing for folks who are, in various parts of their transition. To try on new looks or try on different experiences without it being a big major financial investment. I also love Wing Yun's ability to communicate and ability to create art and ability to like dress in amazing fashions that I would not never even think of. And also just uh, the presence that they bring. Um, I've met Wing Yun and their partner, and while I'm not about to get all off into those other parts of their lives, I think it's so great to have people that you can work with and collaborate with, and yeah, that we can be doing these wonderful community building, world changing things together. So, with that being said, those are my personal thoughts, but I can't wait for you to hear from these two. So, as always, feel free to sit back, relax, engage in the chat, and we will get into a good time. So, Wingyun and Josie, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Darren. Hello, everyone. So excited and grateful to be here. Thank you for this opportunity and for joining Josie and I tonight. Yeah, thank you for being here for this gender diversity workshop for CCF. So we'll start out with first covering some terms around gender. So we'll talk about the terms first, sex and gender. Sometimes those are actually often used interchangeably. And so, what is the difference between sex and gender? We're going to get into it a little bit. So, sex is a categorization of a person as male or female based on biological or physiological characteristics. So, the difference between sex and gender is where sex is categorizing a person as male or female based on um, biological or physiological characteristics. Gender is doing a similar type of categorization, but based on external characteristics or behavior. So, for example, um, you might think of sex as being something that, like, when you go to the doctor, they'll be thinking about your categorization of a person in those terms, as opposed to, when you're walking down the street and somebody sees their external characteristics and might think, of categorizing a person in a certain gender. And what's interesting about both these terms, though, is that both of these terms are actually um, they're constructs, meaning that they are made up, in the sense that these categories of male or female and this social habit that we have of putting people into these categories of male or female, these are social constructs, meaning that they're things that we've developed as a society. And so they're things that can be learned and they're things that can be unlearned. And so um, categorizing folks, whether uh, biological or external characteristics, both are in a way subscribing to these constructs um, of these constructs of a person having to be male or female. And so we'll talk a little bit more. We'll come back to this idea of male and female being this binary in a little bit. But before that, we're going to touch on the terms that you also might be familiar with, um, cisgender and transgender. So cisgender means um, to have an identity that matches the gender that one was assigned at birth, where transgender is having an identity that is different from the gender one was assigned at birth. So when you're born, um, as all of us, as all of us are, when you're born, um, we are assigned a gender. It goes on your birth certificate, and you're assumed that this is the gender that you're going to grow into, that you're going to live into for the rest of your life. And for people who are cisgender, that's not a problem. They are assigned a certain gender based on how they're born, and they are able to go through their lives participating in that gender performance, and it matches how they feel. And so that's what a cisgender experience is like. But for people who are transgender, they do not align or have a different experience of gender than what they were assigned when they were born. So that could be gender that is, maybe they were born and they were assigned one gender, and they identify as having no gender at all. Or they identify as having many genders, or they identify. So in any way, they may differ from having the set gender that they were assigned at birth. So there are many different things that can look like. Transgender, I think, sometimes there's a misconception that it can only look like one kind of monolithic thing, when transgender is an umbrella term that um, can encompass many different types of experience that are similar, though, in the sense that they're different from having the gender expression of what you were assigned at birth. To get into that a little bit further, we'll go back to this idea of the gender binary. The gender binary is a socially accepted idea that there are two genders, male and female. It's very straightforward. You typically represented by the colors blue and pink. Um, and there's nothing inherently male or female about these colors, for example, but they're all part of this system that we've constructed socially that is this gender binary that says that you have to be one thing or you have to be other thing. There's not really any kind of in between. And if you're born, with this assignment, then you must carry out this assignment, and there's no straying from that. And so that is unfortunately the society in which um, we live. Um, and so cis, the prefix cis, has the meaning of being on this side, where trans, the prefix trans means on the other side. But it doesn't just mean on the other side, because people might think that to be trans, you would be, somebody who was born assigned male who has to then identify as the opposite in order to be trans. But trans also has the meaning of beyond. So trans people can also exist beyond this entire gender binary altogether. And so trans has this, again, umbrella term meaning of being um, essentially anywhere but where your gender was pinned down when you were born. Trans people exist anywhere outside of that. So, um, gender, instead, we might want to think of gender as a spectrum. And in one model of thinking of gender as a spectrum, we might see male and female on two poles with this fluid space of non-binary in the middle, where any of these other identities might fall, like genderqueer, demigirl, agender. But two-spirit identity is our particular indigenous identity that only indigenous folks can experience, but it's not exactly a non-binary identity, but there's a little bit of overlap or similarity, although it's definitely its own distinct identity. Gender fluid is another gender experience or identity that doesn't fit onto the gender binary. And so we might even see, though, that this gender binary itself, or sorry, gender spectrum itself is functioning on a two-dimensional model. There are so many ways of experiencing and expressing gender that we really can't even pin them down to a two-dimensional model at all. But this is just kind of one way of maybe stretching our imagination instead of thinking about only two categories, thinking about a spectrum, thinking about a truly like rainbow color, just diverse array of possibilities of what gender can look like. We're going to do a couple more terms and then take a minute for questions. So another term that you may have heard before is non-binary. Does anybody want to sorry, we pulled up. Non-binary means a gender identity that does not fit within the male-female gender binary. So like we talked about in the previous slide. Non-binary, some people may identify as non-binary, or it may be an umbrella term that includes an identity that someone has. And it's also important to note when we are talking about trans folks and we're talking about identifying with the binary and traversing the binary, that not all people who identify as trans undergo medical transition. So there are many different ways to transition. So medical is one category that may include, hormones or surgeries, um, but not all trans people have that experience. Trans people may experience their transition socially by changing maybe their name or pronouns, or how they have folks refer to them. Um, they may change um, or transition legally in changing their documents or gender markers. There are um, ways to transition in, your gender expression outwardly and how you express your physical appearance. So there are many different ways to express and experience trans identity, and sometimes there's the assumption that in order to be trans, that involves going through medical transition, but that's not the case. There are many different ways to identify and experience trans identity. And then one last distinction we want to make is between gender identity and sexual orientation, because sometimes those things can be confused or um, not distinguished. Um, so the difference is actually somebody want to take a stab at distinguishing the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation.
So sexual orientation is who you're attracted to in a romantic or sexual way, and then gender identity is how you identify.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So we could also phrase that as sexual orientation being about your attraction toward others, where gender identity is how you feel about yourself. So essentially, yeah, thank you so much for clarifying that. Sometimes those things um, are can be confused with each other, but sexual orientation is again something that is experienced towards others, and in a way that gender identity is an inner experience about yourself. Um, any questions about any of the terms that we've gone over so far? I know there's been a lot that we've gone over, and some I know we're coming from different places and how our familiarity. Any questions or any clarification that anyone wants to offer? Maybe someone has a better definition of something that they've heard, or yeah, open to feedback. Okay. And if you do have any questions, feel free to let us know in the chat. We can always come back to anything. So we'll do a little review of what we've gone over so far, just to see where everybody's tracking. First question is, what are some examples of ways that someone might transition medically, socially, legally, etc.? Um, if anyone want to share, you can feel free to share in the chat or unmute yourself and share over audio. Okay, well, that was a warm-up question, so we'll see how y'all do with the next one. So, how would you explain non-binary gender identity to someone unfamiliar with the concept? This might be a hard question, but I think it's a very valuable question because it's probably something that you may have to do at some point. Okay, I feel like I'm gonna phone a friend and I'm gonna call him Josie.
Sure, sure. Yeah, so non-binary gender identity is just any gender identity that exists outside of the gender binary, so other than identifying as a man or a woman. So this can look like there's like non-binary can be an identity in and of itself, but there's also other identities like agender or demi-girl, demi-boy, ones that a whole host of identities that can be considered underneath the umbrella of non-binary. Was that a good answer, Wing?
That's great. Sorry, I just
Just
appreciate you. Thank you. All right. Let's move on to part two. We're going to talk about allyship. Josie, you want to go back and forth on these?
sure. Yeah. So here we have some tips for allyship, which are to recognize your gender normative privilege. So it can show up in a lot of ways for cisgender people, from perhaps not being like concerned about like what bathroom am I going to use, right? For some trans people, like going shopping for the first time to look for clothes that affirm their gender identity can be a scary experience, right? Having people assume your gender correctly regularly. And then the second one, in line with that, is to never assume someone's gender based on how they present, right? So we all have been taught in the societies that we live in to assume people's gender based on different gender markers, right? How they dress, what their voice sounds like, different things. But that can cause harm for people across different gender identities when their gender is not guessed correctly. Ask trans siblings how they want you to correct others if they are misgendered or dead named. So some people love and appreciate it when people step in and correct when someone else uses the wrong pronouns. For other people, that can make them feel put on the spot or stuff like that. So it's just important to ask people how they want to be cared for in those moments. Sharing your pronouns along with your name, just in general conversation, or like as I say, on your email signature, Zoom name. These are ways of normalizing talking about gender rather than making assumptions about it. And then when meeting folks who use multiple pronouns, you can ask if they have a preference. Some people will use a binary pronoun alongside of a non-binary pronoun because it's easier for some people, right? Other people want you to use them to intersperse them, right? So just clarifying with folks can be a good way to care for them.
Can you define dead naming before you move on?
Oh, yes. Thank you. So dead naming is when you refer to someone with the name that they were given at birth and not the name that they go by. So sometimes someone's dead name can also be their legal name, right? I haven't changed my name legally. And so when I go into like doctor situations or the pharmacy, I have to use my I tend to use the term prior name because I feel like that has like less of a heavy connotation to dead name. For me, that doesn't feel quite as accurate, but it is still an experience for me that is unpleasant. So yeah, thanks for that question, Carrie.
So we're going to talk a little bit now about how we can reframe our language when we're being more intentionally conscious and aware of the fact that the gender binary is a construct and that not everybody identifies on the gender, with the gender binary. So we want to rethink some of the ways that we speak and in order to include that experience. So, for example, instead of saying something like, this person, Kareem, was born a boy, we might not realize that that's actually basically subscribing to the gender binary. We would instead want to try something else. We could say something like Kareem was assigned male at birth. So instead of affirming the gender binary or something that they don't identify with, it's a way of talking about their gender as something that, when this gender was assigned to them, it wasn't something that they chose or they identified with. And so um, it, um, I guess, allows somebody to not feel like that was something that was, it was something that was assigned to them and not something that they have to identify with any longer. Another example of reframing our language is I've often heard folks use the language of something like talking about people who are female identified or woman identified. We want to have a small group for female identified folks or something like that. And often that's coming from a place of, interest in trying to be more inclusive, but it actually can end up feeling somewhat invalidating to folks who are trans and aren't just, female identified, but are just female, or just, women identified or are just women. So think about how instead of saying something like that, you would just say, this is a group for women, because that actually is an inclusive way to include trans people who identify as women without making them feel like, trans people are only identifying as women and aren't actual women.
Another way that we can practice inclusivity for trans people is in reframing our reproductive language, justice language. So instead of saying this affects all women, does anyone have any ideas for alternative language that we could use? You can drop it in the chat if you want, or unmute.
This affects people who can get pregnant.
Yeah, awesome. This affects people who can get pregnant. Or this affects people with uteruses, right? These are different ways. Honestly, I like this affects people who are pregnant more and can get pregnant more in some ways, right? Because not everyone who has a uterus can necessarily get pregnant, right? And so there's value to this specificity. Like we said at the beginning, we all have things to learn.
Yeah, that's it. And then and instead of saying brothers and sisters, this is a common one we hear a lot in church. We can be more inclusive by simply saying siblings. Yeah, siblings in Christ. Exactly.
I did want to jump back in. I forgot to clarify. So when we're talking about the reproductive justice, right, for people who are men or non-binary people who are assigned female at birth and might be able to get pregnant, right? And so that's why it's important to reframe it, because not everyone who can get pregnant is a woman. So it's like that's the 101 tie-in.
Okay, any questions on this section? I don't know if you all saw, I dropped in the chat also when Josie was talking earlier about gender normative privilege. There was a really helpful document we came across that lists a bunch of, it's like a whole PDF that has a bunch of things that I hadn't really even realized or thought through before about, the privileges that gender normative people hold. And, feel free to look that over too.
Any questions before we go on to the next part?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I am in a lot of women's groups, and I know that a lot of times these groups will use the term woman identified as a way of, or like, sorry, my brain is not, it's not functioning. So these groups are trying to, like, as much as possible, be inclusive of people who are non-binary and gender nonconforming. And so they'll use terms like women identified or people who occupy the space of women or people who are comfortable in women's issues. And that still doesn't completely feel like I see they're trying to be inclusive, but at the same time, it's still like a lot of heavy woman speak. But it's clear, it's clear who they're trying to target things for, but they're also trying to be inclusive of people who may like feel comfortable in those spaces, but not identify as the same thing. Does that make sense?
When it comes to these things, I think it helps to be specific as possible about who the event or group or whatever it is for.
Mm-hmm.
So if the intention is to try to be inclusive of non-binary folks as well as women, then I would maybe just say women and non-binary folks.
Okay.
Then it's being specific and clear because women and women identified folks, like for example, like I'm non-binary, but I don't feel like I would identify as a women identified women and like I feel like
Yeah.
so I think it's a really good question because I think that's a very real situation that a lot of folks find themselves in and wanting to be more inclusive. And so I think in those situations, the more clear we can be about specific. I think just like when you were sharing earlier, the example of like, people who can get pregnant, like that's very specific. And I think that's talking about exactly who we're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay.
I love that too.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah. Another thing we had talked about it before when in terms of thinking about creating groups, right, and naming like what is the group for is just as Bing was saying, like working to be really specific about like what is the goal of having this group be for this specific group of people, right? Like oftentimes and like one of the like oftentimes in churches I think it's common to just separate people into like men and women, right, which like so much to get into with all of that, right? And so sometimes I think that in more affirming inclusive spaces we can like reflexively do that as well, right? I'm not saying that there's like not value in doing that by any means, but like does it make sense to be like, this is like a group for people who are affected by misogyny, right? Like, or so like just like asking the question of like what is our goal in making this group for these for like a specific set of people, right? And then figuring out how to like be most specific with that.
Okay. Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you both.
Yeah, for sure. Any other questions? Okay, we'll have more time for questions later too. I'm going to talk now about some theology. I'm a nerd. I'm super nerdy. I love theology so much. So I'm very excited to get into this with you all. And ask me all the questions you want. Obviously, I don't have all the answers, and that's part of the fun. So we're going to talk about trans-affirming theology 101. So one verse that people often cite when they're trying to support the gender binary is Genesis 1. So God created humans in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So people are saying like God like established this gender binary from the beginning, right? But when we look at this chapter in context, we see that there are many binaries in creation. So when we look at the creation narrative, the creation story, there is day and night, right? There's the land and the sea. And we see in the world around us that there are things that occupy this in-between space, right? So we have day and night, but we also have like twilight and like sunrise. And I forgot to cite the person who I have learned some of this from, so I will include that in some of the documentation. But and then also we have like swamps, right? These places where like the land and the sea exist. And so when we look at this creation narrative from more of a zoomed out perspective, we can see that like there is like language being used that maybe is not necessarily meant to be read as literally as it has been through different streams of Christian thought and practice. And then the other one, so is talking about the gender queer Adam, the rib versus side. So this trans theologian, Shiloh Rosborough, talks about how if you look at the language that is used around Adam being created, there's like a shift in the language from Adam by Adam's self to Adam and Eve, and that this can reveal there's this underlying sense of Adam encompassing more gender-wise, and then Adam and Eve, and then Eve is created from Adam, and so there's a wholeness of humanity that is seen in like a genderqueer, more expansive thing, and not just the specifics of like Adam has to be like male and Eve has to be female. And I can send resources for that to anyone who's interested. And then also we see the inclusion of eunuchs in the biblical narrative. And so in Matthew 19:12, it says there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And in that time period, in that cultural context, eunuchs were seen as a distinct gender role. So they weren't necessarily allowed to occupy the same spaces that other people were, and sometimes they had different roles. Also, we see in Deuteronomy 23:1 that they were excluded from some of the like sacred temple duties and stuff like that. So it's very meaningful for them to be explicitly included in this way, as being said that they're like wanted and important and valued whole and as they are. And so this idea of becoming a eunuch for the kingdom speaks to the way in which like God's inclusion extends to everyone, right? Not just people who fit within like a specific idea of what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman, people who have many different gender expressions and experiences. Delphine says, some scholarship, Daniel the prophet and Joseph are interpreted or seen as eunuchs. Yeah, thank you. Also, people look at Joseph's multicolored coat, right, and read that as a trans narrative sometimes. So there's lots to dig into. And then in Galatians 3, it says, there is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. And so this verse, as we talked about the genderqueer Adam earlier, right, the idea of like Adam encompassing like a multiplicity of genders, right? Christ is the second perfect Adam. And then in Christ, we are all one. And so I think there's a beautiful like gender arc there of like seeing this like multiplicity of creation in the beginning. And then also the way people of many different genders and experiences are welcomed in Christ. And that we have these different experiences that are important and meaningful and shape the ways in which we move throughout the world, but that those don't get in the way of our relationship with God. Any questions? Yeah, I know there is at least one person in the chat who was asking about the intersection of gender and Christianity. I do also have a little bit more that I can talk about with queer theology, but if people have questions, I want to make sure we have prioritized that. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about queering Christ. So looking at Jesus through a queer and trans lens. So does anyone know what this is? Have you seen this before? This is where the nerdy side gets out.
And I'll feel free to bounce it back to me, just as a way of inclusivity. If in whatever words are comfortable, if you describe the image, that will also be helpful for folks for accessibility.
Yes. That's fun. So we have like a painting that's a description, and there is like a almost like vertical eye in the center of it, and then different patterns and stuff around the sides. So it looks a lot like a vulva, and it's meant to be a depiction of the side wound of Christ. So Christ in the crucifixion was pierced by a spear, and this wound was viewed as a source of like contemplation and like different types of prayer at different points in the medieval time periods. And so, yeah, so is often shown to resemble a vulva, and sometimes it's shown with Christ giving birth. So here we have another picture from like an older Middle Ages, yes, somewhere around there, time period, where we have a person being pulled out of the side of Jesus through the side wound. And so there's this theology that developed around Jesus birthing the church through the side wound. And for me as a trans person, I just like love that narrative so much, and I find it very like compelling to have Jesus, who was assigned male at birth, being shown as giving birth, right? This sense of like challenging gender norms, and like that gives me a sense of space and freedom to like explore more of how God works in ways that like don't make sense to us sometimes, or to like the systems of the world. So that's all the thoughts that we have, but we're also very much here for the questions and the dialogue.